£32. The clerk did not look at her when he said it. Eleanor Ashworth did not blink. On the counter between them lay her mother's sapphire brooch, the pearls, the garnets, the mourning ring woven with a lock of hair no one else in the room understood. £32. Her mother had worn that brooch to every significant evening of her life. Her father had purchased it on their 10th anniversary. It had once been appraised at 65. 32. Eleanor repeated. The clerk folded his hands as though the matter were settled. Given the market, madam. Given the market. Eleanor felt the word like a hand pressing down on her shoulder. The coal merchant's invoice was waiting on her kitchen table. The solicitor's letter lay unopened in her writing desk. Her sister needed a proper dress before the season began. £32 would not be enough. She straightened. The sapphire alone was valued at 65 8 years ago, she said calmly. The pearls are matched. The clasp is intact. 32 is not a fair assessment. The clerk smiled the way men smiled when they believed patience was generosity. Times change. Yes, Eleanor said. They do. And that was precisely why she would not accept being treated like a woman who did not understand numbers. She placed both hands lightly on the counter. 38. The clerk blinked. I beg your pardon. £38, she said. For the collection. Silence settled over the shop. Dust drifted through the narrow beam of morning light from the window. A carriage passed outside. Somewhere down Clarendon Street, a bell rang. The clerk leaned back slightly. Madam, the offer I've made is... The shop door opened. The sound was not loud, but it changed the air. The clerk stopped speaking. Eleanor felt it before she saw him, the subtle shift in posture, the quickened deference in the clerk's expression. She turned. He was tall. That was her first thought. Not handsome. Not imposing. Simply tall in a way that made the narrow shop seem narrower. Charcoal coat. Perfectly cut. Gloves in one hand. Hat untouched. He did not look at the cases. He did not glance around. He looked at the counter. And at her. I telephoned ahead, he said evenly. About the Marlowe watch. Why yes, Your Grace, the clerk said. Your Grace. Eleanor's pulse moved once, sharply, and then steadied. A duke, then. He stepped closer. His gaze shifted to the velvet pouch, to the brooch, to the pearls. What are you selling? He asked. The question was quiet. Not idle. Not curious. Focused. My mother's jewels, Eleanor said. He extended his hand. He did not demand. He did not explain. He simply held out his palm as though he expected the world to place what mattered into it. For one suspended second, Eleanor considered refusing. Then she picked up the sapphire brooch and placed it in his hand. Eleanor Ashworth was 24 years old, the daughter of a barrister of good standing, and she was doing the third of these things. The morning she walked into Harwick & Sons was the morning she made herself a promise. She would not cry. She had made that promise before. At her father's funeral, when the solicitor read the will aloud and the figures were far smaller than anyone had expected. At the bank, when the manager explained the situation in the slow, careful voice men reserved for women they believed could not understand arithmetic. At her own kitchen table, at 11 o'clock at night, when she had counted the coins in the household tin and arrived at a conclusion she could not argue with. She had kept the promise each time. She intended to keep it now. Harwick & Sons occupied a narrow building on Clarendon Street in London, wedged between a printer's shop and a tea merchant. The sign above the door was gold on black, restrained, expensive-looking. The kind of establishment that did not need to advertise what it was, because everyone who needed to know already knew. It was what Victorians called a repository, a discreet second-hand dealer in fine goods, the destination of last resort for families whose fortunes had quietly reversed. The interior smelled of old wood and polish. Glass cases lined the walls, their contents arranged with the precision of a military exhibition. Pocket watches, cameo brooches, pearl drop earrings, a set of silver candlesticks with the crests carefully removed. Things that had once mattered enormously to someone, now waiting to matter to someone else. A clerk approached. Young, soft-chinned, with the practiced expression of polite indifference. Good morning, Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced that too. She set the velvet pouch on the counter. She did not clutch it. She did not hesitate. She simply set it down and stepped back, as though it were of no particular consequence, which was the precise opposite of the truth. The clerk opened the pouch without ceremony. He lifted the brooch first, her mother's sapphire brooch, oval-cut stones set in silver filigree, purchased by her father on their 10th anniversary and worn to every gathering of significance for 2 decades thereafter. Eleanor looked at the glass case across the room. The clerk examined the eardrops next. The pearl bracelet. The mourning ring with its tiny seed pearls arranged around a lock of someone's grandmother's hair. Mourning jewelry was a peculiarly Victorian institution, an entire industry built around grief, where locks of hair from the deceased were woven into brooches and rings as keepsakes. They were intimate objects. They were not meant to end up in shop windows. "These are adequate pieces," the clerk said finally. "Adequate." Eleanor kept her expression composed. "I can offer you £32 for the collection." He said it with the manner of a man offering considerably more than he was obliged to. £32. She had estimated closer to 80, perhaps 90 for the brooch alone. Her father had told her what he'd paid for it, and her father had not been a man who misremembered numbers. The sapphire brooch, she said quietly, was appraised at £65 8 years ago. 8 years ago, perhaps. The clerk did not look embarrassed. "The market has adjusted." Eleanor looked at the brooch lying on the counter. She thought of her mother wearing it to the Carrington Assembly, how the blue stones caught the candlelight, how her mother touched it absently during conversation, as though it were a small good luck charm she kept on her chest. She thought of the coal merchant's invoice waiting on the kitchen table. She thought of the sum still owed to the solicitor. She thought of her sister Margaret, who was 17 and deserved at least one proper season even if circumstances had become what they were. 38, Eleanor said. The clerk blinked. "I beg your pardon." £38, she said. "For the collection. Not 32. He smiled the way men smiled when they wished to appear patient. "Madam, the offer I've made is quite fair given." "It is not fair," Eleanor said. She said it without heat, simply as a correction of a factual error. "The garnets alone are worth £7. The pearl bracelet is good quality, the clasp is intact, and the pearls are matched. 38 is still below market value, but I am prepared to accept it." A silence fell over the shop. The clerk looked at her for the first time with something other than polite indifference. He had not expected that. Men in his position rarely did. "I'll need to consult with—" "Please do," Eleanor said. She folded her hands and waited. She was still waiting, composed, still, watching dust motes drift through the light from the front window, when the door behind her opened. She did not turn immediately. She had learned that drawing attention to herself served no useful purpose. But the shop changed. It was not something she could have explained to anyone who hadn't felt it. The air shifted. The clerk straightened. The soft ambient sounds of Clarendon Street seemed to step aside, the way crowds in narrow Victorian thoroughfares parted instinctively, not because anyone asked them to, but because certain kinds of authority occupied space differently from other men. Eleanor turned. The man who had entered was tall. He carried his height differently from most tall men, not with the slight apologetic stoop some developed, not with rigid self-consciousness, but with an absolute economy, as though his body occupied exactly the space it intended to, and not 1 inch more. Perhaps 34. Dark-haired, clean-shaven. His coat was charcoal gray and superbly cut. He wore it the way men wore things when they had never been required to think about what they wore. His gloves were in his right hand. He had not removed his hat. He did not look around the shop the way visitors did. He looked directly at the clerk. "I telephoned ahead," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Regarding the Marlowe pocket watch." "Yes, Your Grace." The clerk had transformed entirely. Every trace of the man who had said adequate had vanished. "Of course. If you'll allow me a moment." "Take your time," the man said. He moved to the far glass case and stood before it with his hands loosely at his sides, examining its contents with the patient attention of someone who was never in a hurry because urgency was a condition that happened to other people. Eleanor returned her attention to the counter. She was not going to be distracted by a tall man in an expensive coat. She had come with a purpose. The clerk reappeared from the back room carrying a pocket watch in a small case lined with cream silk. He set it before the Duke with the ceremony of a sacrament. £38, Eleanor said, when the clerk glanced at her as though surprised she was still there. We were discussing £38. The clerk looked between her and the Duke with the expression of a man who wished very much to be somewhere else. 34, he offered. That is my final. What are you selling? The question came from her left. Quietly, without inflection. The way one might ask the time. Eleanor turned. The Duke was not looking at the clerk. He was looking at her. His eyes were dark, not dramatically so, simply dark, and observant in a way that suggested he had already taken in considerably more than he appeared to. My mother's jewels, she said. He held out his hand. It was not a demand, not a request, simply an open palm, waiting. The gesture of a man who expected compliance without requiring it. Eleanor looked at his hand, then at his face. Then, with the calm deliberation of a woman who had decided there was very little left she could afford in the way of pride, she picked up the sapphire brooch from the counter and placed it in his palm. He examined it, turned it twice, held it briefly toward the window. What did he offer? He asked. 32 for the collection, Eleanor said. I have negotiated him to 34. You said 38. He said 34. The Duke set the brooch down on the counter. He looked at the clerk. 45, he said. The clerk opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Your Grace, the assessment is wrong. His tone did not change. It carried no particular force. It was simply a statement that had no interest in being argued with. £45 for the collection. Have the sum prepared. He picked up the pocket watch case and turned toward the door. Your Grace. He paused. She had not planned to speak. The words arrived before she could stop them, because she was not a woman who received things without accounting for them. I did not ask for your assistance, she said. He turned. Not fully. Just enough to look at her over his shoulder. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not amusement, something quieter than either of those things. No, he said. You didn't. A pause. One beat too long to be casual. What is your name? He asked. It was not said the way men asked women's names at parties, as social preamble, as courtesy, as performance. It was asked the way he had asked everything else, with the focused attention of a man who wanted the answer because he wanted it, and not for any other reason. Eleanor looked at him across the width of the shop. Ashworth, she said. Eleanor Ashworth. He held her gaze for a moment, said nothing. Then he walked out. Eleanor stood very still. The clerk stared at her with the expression of a man who would be telling his wife about this for a week. She turned back to the counter. £45, she said. If you please. She did not think about him again for 11 days. That was what she told herself. The £45 covered the coal merchant and the solicitor's outstanding fee and left enough to pay Mrs. Peel, their cook of 14 years, who had stayed on past the point of good sense out of what she called loyalty and Eleanor privately called the most generous stubbornness she had ever witnessed. She bought Margaret 2 yards of pale blue muslin. Not enough for a ball gown. Enough for something respectable. Life continued. Then the letter arrived. It came not from a man she had met briefly in a jeweler's shop. It came, on a Tuesday morning, from a firm of solicitors in Lincoln's Inn, Hartley, Price & Associates, on behalf of their client Lady Dorothea Voss, formerly Lady Dorothea Ashmore before her marriage, currently residing at Whitmore Grange, Northumberland, who was in need of a companion of good family and sound mind for her permanent residence there. Lady Vane had recommended Miss Eleanor Ashworth. The position included accommodation, a modest salary, and, the letter was careful to note, full household authority over the domestic arrangements of the Grange. Lady Dorothea, it explained, was 71 years old, sharp of mind, frail of body, and entirely unwilling to be managed by anyone who thought frailty was an invitation to condescension. Eleanor read the letter twice. It is important to understand what such a letter meant in 1871. The position of lady's companion was one of the very few respectable options available to a gentlewoman who needed to earn her living. It carried none of the stigma of governess work, which placed a woman in an awkward social position between the family and the servants, and none of the social death of shop work or needlework for hire. A companion to an aristocratic widow was, in the eyes of society, still a gentlewoman. She attended social events with her employer. She was received at dinners. She moved in a world that recognized her as a person of quality, even if her circumstances had changed. The salary was not large. The accommodation was in Northumberland, which was a great distance from London and Margaret's prospects. But the alternative was Uncle Cornelius and the question of market rent, and the 2 months she did not have. She showed the letter to Margaret, who read it twice and then said, "Who is Lady Dorothea Voss?" "She was Lady Dorothea Ashmore before her marriage," Eleanor said. "Presumably a connection of the Ashmore family." Margaret looked at her with the expression of someone who has noticed a coincidence and is deciding whether to mention it. Eleanor had noticed it too. She said nothing. "Northumberland," Margaret said. "It is not so remote as all that," Eleanor said. "The letter says 10 miles from a market town. There are assemblies." Margaret looked at the letter again. Then she looked at Eleanor with the steady attention of a 17-year-old who was considerably more observant than people gave her credit for. "You have already decided," Margaret said. "I have considered it carefully," Eleanor said. "Yes," Margaret said. "I know. That is what I said." Eleanor wrote her acceptance the following morning. Clear, brief, professional. She confirmed the terms and asked whether she might bring her younger sister, who would serve as no inconvenience and might be of assistance in the household. The reply came within 3 days. Lady Dorothea would be delighted. Whitmore Grange was reached by train from King's Cross to York, a journey that took 5 hours on the newly expanded Great Northern Railway, which had been transforming the English countryside since the 1840s, reducing what had once been a 2-day carriage journey to an afternoon's travel, and then by carriage along a road that had seen better decades. As the carriage crested the last rise, the house revealed itself, and Margaret stopped mid-sentence. It was large without being aggressive about it. Grey stone, 3 stories, older than anything Eleanor had expected. It carried its age with a solidity that had nothing to apologize for, not the polished grandeur of a newly built estate, but the deep, settled permanence of a house that had stood through 3 centuries of weather and family and did not require anyone's admiration to feel secure in itself. The grounds were overgrown in places. The kitchen garden had survived through the groundskeeper's loyalty rather than any official mandate. The formal gardens had once been something and could be something again. Mrs. Drummond met them at the door. She was a woman of perhaps 60, straight-backed, with eyes that assessed and filed in a single glance. "Miss Ashworth," she said, "Lady Dorothea is in the east sitting room. She asked that you come to her directly." "Of course," Eleanor said. "Shall I leave my coat?" "Come as you are," Mrs. Drummond said. "She doesn't stand on ceremony. She does, however, stand on punctuality." Eleanor followed her through the entrance hall and along a corridor lined with portraits, mostly men in various stages of military or political importance, and stopped before a door at the far end. Mrs. Drummond knocked twice and opened it. The east sitting room was warm, cluttered in the particular way of rooms inhabited by a person who had lived a long time and accumulated evidence of it. Books on every surface. A fire burning despite the mildness of the weather. 2 dogs of indeterminate breed occupying the best chair. Lady Dorothea Voss sat in a chair by the window, wrapped in a shawl despite the fire, holding a letter in one hand and a pair of spectacles in the other. She was small, white-haired, with eyes that were, Eleanor thought, the sharpest she had seen on a person of any age. "Miss Ashworth," she said, without looking up from the letter. "Sit down. I'll be with you in a moment. I'm reading something infuriating." Eleanor sat. She waited. She was good at waiting. After approximately 90 seconds, Lady Dorothea set the letter aside with the deliberate care of someone placing something they intend to return to and deal with properly. "Lady Vane tells me you argued a shop clerk up to £45 from 32, she said, looking at Eleanor properly for the first time. "In front of witnesses." "The collection was worth considerably more than 32, Eleanor said. "Undoubtedly. But most women in your position would have taken the 32 and been grateful for it." She studied Eleanor with a directness that was not unkind. "Why didn't you?" "Because my father taught me that accepting a wrong figure as a kindness is not gratitude," Eleanor said. "It is simply a failure of arithmetic." Lady Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "I had a companion for 6 years," she said. "Miss Parrish. Excellent woman. Agreed with everything I said. I found it intolerable." She picked up the infuriating letter again, then set it down again. "My nephew visits frequently. You will find him either entirely agreeable or entirely insufferable depending on your temperament. Most people find him insufferable. I find him the most honest man in England, which amounts to the same thing." Eleanor filed this away. "The dogs are not to be moved from the chair," Lady Dorothea continued. "The accounts for the household are in a state I can only describe as catastrophic, which you will please address at your earliest convenience. Dinner is at 7. I do not eat breakfast before 9. And I would very much like to know your opinion of the Disraeli government, but we can save that for tomorrow." Eleanor looked at the dogs. They looked back at her with the satisfied authority of creatures who had never in their lives been asked to compromise. "I'll see to the accounts in the morning," she said. Lady Dorothea smiled. It was not a warm smile exactly. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone to say exactly that. The Duke of Ashmore arrived on the 4th day. Eleanor was in the estate office, a room that had apparently not been organized since the previous decade, and smelled of it, when she heard the carriage on the drive. She did not go to the window. She was in the middle of cross-referencing 3 years of accounts against a ledger that contradicted itself on 17 separate occasions, and she intended to finish the page she was on. She heard his voice in the entrance hall. Low, unhurried. The same quality she had noticed in the shop. She turned back to the ledger. She was still at the desk when Mrs. Drummond appeared in the doorway. "His Grace the Duke of Ashmore," Mrs. Drummond said, with the expression of someone delivering information they are confident has already been understood. "Thank you, Mrs. Drummond," Eleanor said. Mrs. Drummond did not leave. "He knows you are here," she said. Lady Dorothea told him at breakfast. "He will want to meet you. Then he may come to the estate office," Eleanor said. "I have 4 more pages of this ledger." Mrs. Drummond looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman revising an assessment upward. "Yes, miss," she said, and withdrew. He appeared in the doorway 11 minutes later. Eleanor did not look up immediately. She finished the entry she was writing. Then she looked up. He was standing in the doorway with one hand on the frame, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. Not surprise, not quite. Something closer to the expression of a man who has found something exactly where he left it and is not entirely certain whether this pleases him or unsettles him. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Your Grace," she said. A pause. "My aunt said she had engaged a new companion," he said. "Yes." "She did not mention your name." "No," Eleanor said. "I don't suppose she did." He stepped into the room. He looked at the ledgers spread across the desk. 3 years of disordered accounts, the contradictions she had marked in red, the separate column she had started to reconcile them. "How long has it been in this state?" he asked. "At minimum since 1868, Eleanor said. "Possibly longer. The 1867 records are missing entirely. I sent a man to review the accounts in 1869. "Then your man was either incompetent or dishonest," Eleanor said. "The discrepancies are not subtle." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'll leave you to it," he said. He left. Eleanor returned to the ledger. She was aware, in a way she did not examine closely, that her pulse had done something irregular in the past 3 minutes. She attributed this to the coffee Mrs. Drummond had brought at 11 o'clock, which had been much stronger than she was accustomed to. She turned the page. Lady Dorothea Voss was, Eleanor discovered over the first 2 weeks, a woman of extraordinary and quietly deployed intelligence. She had been born in 1800, the youngest daughter of the 4th Duke of Ashmore, in a world where women of her class were educated in accomplishments rather than subjects. She had taught herself Latin from her brother's schoolbooks. She had corresponded, under a masculine pseudonym, with 2 fellows of the Royal Society on the subject of geological formations in the Scottish Highlands. She had read every significant political pamphlet published in England since 1820, and had opinions about all of them that were considerably better reasoned than those of most men Eleanor had encountered. "Women of my generation," she told Eleanor one morning over breakfast, without any particular bitterness, "were permitted to be intelligent as long as we were also invisible. I chose to be both, because the alternative was to be neither." Eleanor looked at her over the teacup. "And now I am 71 years old and have outlived everyone who required my invisibility," Lady Dorothea said serenely. "I find I have a great deal to say." She said much of it to Eleanor, who listened and argued and was never once told that her arguments were inappropriate for a woman of her position. It was, Eleanor thought, the most educational arrangement she had been part of since her father's study, where she had spent her childhood reading his law books and been expected to have opinions about what she found there. The Duke visited twice in the first 3 weeks. Both times he spent the mornings in discussion with the estate's groundskeeper and the afternoons with Lady Dorothea. Both times Eleanor was present for the afternoon conversations. Both times he addressed her with the same precise courtesy he applied to everything. Both times, when he left, Lady Dorothea watched the door close behind him with an expression Eleanor could not read. "My nephew," Lady Dorothea said one afternoon, after the second visit, "has been managing this estate by correspondence for 4 years. He believes correspondence is an adequate substitute for presence." "He is a duke," Eleanor said. "He has 17 other things requiring his attention." "Yes," Lady Dorothea said. "He is very good at requiring his attention to be elsewhere." She picked up her embroidery. "His mother died when he was 26. She was the person he was most honest with. He has been, since then, very controlled." Eleanor said nothing. "I am not asking you to feel sorry for him," Lady Dorothea said. "I am simply explaining the landscape." She returned to her embroidery. Eleanor returned to the household accounts. Neither of them said anything further. But Eleanor thought about it that evening, alone in the estate office, with the accounts in order around her and the November wind beginning to find the gaps in the window frames. She thought about the landscape and what it meant to have been told about it. On the 18th day of November, Eleanor found the letter. She had been sorting through Lady Dorothea's family papers at the older woman's request. This was not uncommon work for a companion in the Victorian household: the management of correspondence, the organization of family records, the preservation of documents that had accumulated over decades without system. What was less common was that Eleanor did this work with the methodical attention of someone trained by a barrister father to treat every piece of paper as potential evidence. The letter was filed between a survey report from 1867 and a legal submission from 1871. It had been placed there by someone who either hadn't read it or had read it and very much hoped it would not be found. It was dated 1869. It was from the original boundary surveyor employed by Whitmore Grange, a Mr. Simmons of the firm Simmons and Carrick, Newcastle, addressed to the previous Duke of Ashmore. It was brief and written in the careful language of a professional man putting something uncomfortable in writing while trying to appear to be doing no such thing. It stated that the boundary survey, as conducted, had relied on a reference point that was, and here the language became particularly careful, understood by both parties to be provisional pending final determination of the old stone marker at the northeastern corner of the Ashfield boundary. It further noted that the stone marker had never been finally determined, owing to a dispute between the respective surveyors that had not been resolved before Mr. Simmons' retirement. Eleanor read it twice. Then she sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. The boundary dispute between Whitmore Grange and the adjacent Ashfield estate had been in active litigation for 4 years. Sir Edmund Clary of Ashfield was claiming that a substantial portion of Whitmore Grange's North Field was, in fact, Ashfield land, based on the 1869 survey. The 1869 survey that both parties had known at the time was not final, which meant the entire legal case being advanced against Whitmore Grange was built on a document that the opposing party, or their predecessors, had known to be incomplete. Eleanor stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the North Field in question, which was currently occupied by 3 cows and entirely unaware of its own legal significance. Then she picked up the letter and went to find the Duke. He was in the library. He had arrived that morning for what he described to Lady Dorothea as a few days to review matters, phrasing that Eleanor had noticed and filed away without comment. He was at the large desk with papers spread before him, writing in the precise, unhurried hand she had come to recognize. She knocked. "Come in," he said, without looking up. She came in. She crossed to the desk. She set the letter in front of him without preamble. He looked at it. He picked it up. He read it. Eleanor watched his face. It did not change dramatically. It never did. But she had been watching him for 3 weeks now, and she had learned to read the small things. And what she saw, as he moved through the letter's careful language to its careful conclusion, was a man arriving at a recognition that had cost him something. He set the letter down. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window, the same window she had stood at 4 minutes ago, looking at the same 3 cows in the same north field, and both hands came up and pressed flat against the window frame. One involuntary gesture, there and gone in less than 2 seconds, the physical response of a man absorbing something that had reached him somewhere his composure did not extend. Then his hands dropped. His shoulders settled. He turned. "Where was this?" he said. "Lady Dorothea's family papers," Eleanor said. "Filed between an 1867 survey report and an 1871 legal submission." "Clary's solicitor reviewed the estate papers 2 years ago," he said. "As part of the discovery process." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I saw that in the correspondence. I looked for his acknowledgement of this letter. There is none." A silence. "If Clary's solicitor saw this letter and chose not to disclose it," he began, "then the case being advanced against Whitmore Grange is being argued on evidence the opposing party knows to be incomplete," Eleanor said. "That is not a boundary dispute. That is something considerably more serious." He looked at her, in the particular way he sometimes did, with that focused, total attention she had first noticed in the shop on Clarendon Street. The attention of someone who was genuinely seeing rather than simply looking. "You found this in 3 weeks," he said. "I found it because I was looking at everything," she said. "Your 1869 man was presumably looking only at what he expected to find." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need to write to my legal counsel tonight." "Yes," she said. "You do." She turned to leave. "Miss Ashworth." She stopped. She did not turn around. She had the sudden, clear instinct that if she turned around she would see something on his face she was not yet prepared to see, and that seeing it too soon would require her to do something with it before she understood it properly. "The letter should be kept separately from the other documents," she said, to the door. "I'll arrange it." "Thank you," he said. She left the library. In the corridor, she stood against the wall with her eyes closed for a moment. She was not, she told herself, affected by a man who had pressed his hands against a window frame for 2 seconds. She was simply doing her work. The Harwick Market Assembly Rooms occupied the upper floor of the old town hall, a Georgian building that had been many things in its 2 centuries and was currently serving as the social epicenter of the county's middle and upper classes. Assemblies in this period were a serious institution. They were where reputations were made and damaged, where marriages were arranged and arrangements collapsed, where every piece of social information in a 50-mile radius was exchanged under the fiction of dancing. Eleanor attended at Mrs. Drummond's instruction, with Margaret, who wore the pale blue muslin and was radiant with the uncomplicated excitement of a young woman who had been somewhat isolated and was now, emphatically, not. Sir Edmund Clary was there. Eleanor recognized him from the description she had assembled over the previous weeks. He was 55, broad-shouldered, with the ruddy complexion of a man who rode for pleasure and ate for comfort. He was a justice of the peace and a magistrate and a man who had, by all accounts, never in his life been required to question his own standing in any room he entered. He had not yet seen her. She did not seek to be seen. She remained in conversation with the wife of the local solicitor, a Mrs. Crane who was pleasant and genuinely interested in the question of what Eleanor intended to do with the East Garden. Eleanor discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she had developed opinions about the East Garden that were worth sharing. It was Mrs. Hartwell who found her first. Mrs. Hartwell was the wife of a prosperous mill owner who had attached herself to the edges of polite society with the determination of a climbing plant and the selective memory of a woman who preferred not to recall the recency of her own arrival. She was not malicious in her marrow, Eleanor thought. She was simply afraid of her own precarious position, and afraid of anything that reminded her that precarious positions were the natural condition of almost everyone in any room. "Miss Ashworth," She arrived with the precision of someone who had been watching for her opportunity. Lady Dorothea's new companion. "We have all been so curious." "Good evening, Mrs. Hartwell," Eleanor said. "It must be such a change," Mrs. Hartwell said, in the tone of someone offering sympathy while delivering its opposite. "From London. From whatever your life was before." A pause, precisely calculated. "I understand your father was a very fine barrister. Before things became difficult." "He was an excellent barrister," Eleanor said, "and a more careful man with accounts than any I have since encountered." Mrs. Hartwell's smile did not waver. "Of course. And yet here you are." The smile expanded slightly, the particular expansion of a smile that believes it has made its point. One does wonder what he would make of it. His daughter, in service. The group around them was not large. 5 people. But 5 was sufficient. 5 would do. Eleanor was aware of Mrs. Crane going still beside her. She was aware of the particular quality of attention that had settled on the gathering, the held breath of people who have understood that something is happening and are waiting to see what happens next. She was also aware, and this was the part that Mrs. Hartwell had miscalculated, that she was not the daughter of a barrister for nothing. Her father had cross-examined witnesses for 30 years. He had taught her that a question dressed as a statement was still a question, and that the correct response to a question you had been asked to make you feel small was simply a better question. "I wonder the same thing sometimes," Eleanor said. Her voice was entirely conversational. He spent his career demonstrating that the quality of a person's character is not determined by the circumstances they find themselves in. "I imagine he would be pleased to see me demonstrating the same principle." A pause of her own. "What do you imagine your father would make of you, Mrs. Hartwell?" The silence that followed had a texture. Mrs. Hartwell opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "Miss Ashworth." The voice came from behind her left shoulder. Quiet. Unhurried. Carrying the particular quality she had learned to recognize before she turned toward it. He was standing 3 feet away. He had not been there a moment ago. He was now, composed, still, looking at Mrs. Hartwell with the calm attention of someone who had heard every word and was deciding how much of that to make apparent. Mrs. Hartwell's color changed. "Lady Dorothea asked me to find you," he said to Eleanor. "She wishes you to meet the Countess of Harwick before supper." This was, Eleanor was fairly certain, not true. Lady Dorothea had retired at 8:30 and would not have sent anyone to find her. But she looked at him and understood that the intervention was the point, not the explanation, and that questioning the explanation in this moment would serve no one. "Of course," she said. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked across the assembly room floor. Behind them, Eleanor heard the particular silence that is louder than conversation, the silence of 5 people processing what they have just seen, calculating what it means, beginning the work of deciding what to say about it tomorrow. She did not look back. They reached the far side of the room, near the windows, where the crowd was thinner and the light from the chandeliers fell at an angle that made the dust motes in the air visible, turning them briefly golden. "There is no Countess of Harwick," Eleanor said. "There is not," he agreed. A pause. "You were managing it," he said. "It was not a question." "I had it in hand," she said. "Yes," he said. "You did. And then you had more than managed it." He was looking at the room rather than at her, but she could feel the quality of his attention even in profile. "Your father's daughter." She turned to look at him. He turned at the same moment. They were closer than she had realized. The angle of the room, the press of the crowd, the direction they had walked, all of it had brought them to within a foot of each other, and neither of them had moved to correct it. "You knew who I was," she said. "In the shop. Before I told you my name. You already knew." He did not deny it. He also did not confirm it. He simply looked at her with that dark, steady attention. "Lady Vane had mentioned you," he said. "In passing." "In passing." "Yes. And yet you asked my name," she said. "At the door." Something shifted in his expression. Something small and involuntary and immediately controlled. The same quality as the hands on the window frame, a response that had arrived before the composure could manage it. "I wanted to hear you say it," he said. It was said quietly. said the way things were said when they were said too simply to be anything other than true. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then, "Sir Edmund Clary is watching us from the far wall," she said. He turned. He looked. Clary was indeed watching them from across the room, with the expression of a man recalculating something. "Let him watch," the Duke said. "He came over to me earlier," Eleanor said, "before you arrived. He made a comment about my father." He turned back to her. "What did he say?" "That my father was a good man but not always prudent. Ambition exceeding his means." A pause. "My father," Eleanor said, "died of a long illness that depleted the estate gradually and without mercy. It had nothing to do with imprudence and nothing to do with ambition. It had to do with being ill for 4 years and with the fact that medical care in this country costs money that good men do not always have." She had not intended to say that. Not all of it. But it was said now, and she did not regret it. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not pity. She would have stopped speaking if she had seen pity. Something quieter than pity. Something that recognized without diminishing. "Clary's solicitor," he said carefully, "reviewed the estate papers in 1869. He will know by now that I have been in correspondence with my legal counsel. He will be calculating what I know." "Then let him calculate," Eleanor said. "And let him calculate that he is doing it in front of a room full of witnesses who have watched him make a comment about my father tonight." A silence. "Yes," he said slowly. "Let him calculate that." Across the room, the music was beginning again. A new dance forming, the kind of progressive country dance that the Victorians had inherited from the Georgians before them, where partners changed and reformed and changed again in long winding patterns down the floor. An entire social ritual encoded in movement, where who danced with whom was information, and the information was always observed. He offered his hand. Not with ceremony. Not with the performance of a man making a public statement. Simply the same open, waiting gesture she had seen twice before. The gesture of a man who had no interest in anything that was not freely given. Eleanor looked at his hand. She placed hers in it. They joined the dance. And Clary, from the far wall, watched them with the expression of a man who had come to this assembly expecting a manageable evening and had arrived instead at the conclusion that his situation had changed. The legal correspondence that followed the discovery of the 1869 letter was, by any measure, swift. Ashmore's counsel, a firm of considerable standing in Lincoln's Inn, responded within 4 days of receiving the letter and the accompanying documentation. Their assessment was unequivocal. The boundary survey of 1869 had been conducted on a provisional basis explicitly acknowledged by both parties at the time, and subsequently argued in court as though it were a final and authoritative document. This constituted, at minimum, a serious procedural irregularity and, at maximum, something considerably less polite. Within 2 weeks, Clary's solicitor had withdrawn the case. There was no dramatic scene. No courtroom confrontation. No public unraveling. The Victorian legal system conducted its most significant reversals in correspondence, in the careful language of men who preferred to let letters do what direct speech would make too dangerous. A letter arrived. Another letter departed. The case, which had occupied 4 years of litigation and an unknowable quantity of the Ashmore estate's resources, ceased to exist. Eleanor read the final letter 3 times. Then she filed it in a folder she labeled Resolved and placed it on the library desk where the Duke would find it in the morning. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, predominantly, tired, the particular tiredness of a task completed that had required sustained attention. And beneath it, something quieter, the satisfaction of a wrong thing corrected. Not spectacularly. Not publicly. Simply correctly. A letter arrived from Uncle Cornelius 3 weeks after the case was withdrawn. It was shorter than his previous letter and considerably softer in tone. It suggested, with an elegance of indirection that Eleanor could only admire professionally, that the arrangement regarding Pendleton Square might be maintained at its existing terms after all. Circumstances had changed, the letter explained, without specifying what circumstances or in what direction they had changed. Eleanor filed this letter in a folder she labeled also Resolved. She showed neither letter to the Duke. He did not ask. But on the evening after the legal correspondence concluded, Lady Dorothea called Eleanor into the east sitting room after dinner and dismissed the dogs from the chair and asked her to sit. My nephew, Lady Dorothea said, without preamble, has been managing this estate at a distance for 4 years because being here required him to be present, and being present required him to feel things he had decided not to feel. Eleanor waited. His mother's illness was long, Lady Dorothea continued. He managed her affairs. He managed the estate. He managed everything that needed managing, and when she died, he continued managing everything because stopping would have meant there was nothing left to manage. She looked at the fire. I have watched him for 5 years become a man who is excellent at his responsibilities and very good at ensuring his responsibilities leave no room for anything else. Lady Dorothea, Eleanor said carefully. I am not matchmaking, Lady Dorothea said. I am 71 years old, and I have watched too many people waste their time on misunderstandings that could have been prevented by someone simply saying the thing plainly. I am saying the thing plainly. She looked at Eleanor directly. He asks after you in his letters. He has asked after you in every letter since you arrived. He does not ask after Mrs. Drummond, who has been here for 20 years. He does not ask after the groundskeeper, who prevented a significant drainage problem in October. He asks after you. Eleanor looked at the fire. I am his aunt's companion, she said. Yes, Lady Dorothea said. You are. And a very good one. That is not what I am discussing. A silence. I don't know what to do with this information, Eleanor said honestly. No, Lady Dorothea agreed. Most people don't, the first time someone tells them that another person finds them worth thinking about. They generally manage eventually. She picked up her embroidery. He arrives on Friday, she said. For the month. Eleanor looked at her. He asked, Lady Dorothea said serenely, whether the legal matter had been resolved satisfactorily. I told him it had. I told him that you had been instrumental. I may have mentioned that you intended to address the East Garden Wall in December. A pause. He said he would like to see the progress. The East Garden Wall, Eleanor said. Apparently, Lady Dorothea said, it is a matter of great interest to him. She returned to her embroidery with the expression of a woman who had said exactly what she intended and not one word more. December at Whitmore Grange had a particular quality. The light came in low and gold and was gone by 3:30. The cold arrived in earnest, not the mild grey cold of London, but the deep, settled cold of Northumberland, where the wind came off the moors with nothing between it and the house to slow it down. The fires were banked high. The dogs migrated from the east sitting room to the library, where the hearth was larger. He arrived on a Friday, as Lady Dorothea had said. The month that followed was, in its outward details, unremarkable. He reviewed the estate matters with the groundskeeper. He corresponded with his parliamentary obligations in London. He dined with Lady Dorothea and, by extension, with Eleanor. He read in the evenings in the library. He walked the grounds in the mornings, occasionally accompanied by the dogs, occasionally, on days when Eleanor had been in the East Garden assessing the progress of the wall repointing and had not managed to return to the house before he came past, accompanied by Eleanor. These walks were not long. They were not, on the surface, remarkable. They were the kind of proximity that accumulates. Conversation about the frost on the kitchen garden beds, about the groundskeeper's assessment of the north pasture, about a book Eleanor had been reading, about a question Lady Dorothea had raised at dinner. And beneath all of it, patient and unspoken, something else. Eleanor had been in service to Lady Dorothea for 6 weeks. She had spent those 6 weeks learning the Grange and its accounts and its history. She had spent them learning Lady Dorothea, whose intelligence and directness she had come to regard with something approaching reverence. She had spent them, too, learning the particular quality of a presence that arrived every other week and changed the temperature of every room it entered, not through intention, not through drama, but simply through being what it was. She was not a woman given to self-deception. She understood what was happening to her. She was considerably less certain what was happening to him. On the last evening of December, she came into the library late. She had finished her book an hour before. She had sat in her room telling herself she was not going to go back downstairs. She had gone back downstairs. He was there, sitting by the fire with a book open on his knee, one lamp lit, the rest of the room in shadow. The dogs were at his feet. The fire had burned down to a steady, low heat. He looked up when he heard her. "I thought you had gone to bed," he said. "I had one more chapter," she said. She took her usual chair, the one by the second lamp, closer to the fire than the window. He returned to his book. She opened hers. For a while, a comfortable while, the kind of while that has no anxiety in it, they read. Then she became aware that he had set his book down. He was looking at the fire. Both hands rested on the arms of the chair, entirely still. His face was in three-quarter profile, the firelight working along the line of his jaw. He was thinking about something. She had learned to recognize this, the quality of his stillness when he was thinking as opposed to the quality of it when he was simply present. This was the other kind, the kind that had a direction. She kept her eyes on her page. "Miss Ashworth," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her, with the expression she had learned over 6 weeks, the expression she did not yet have a complete language for, the one that appeared when his composure had brought him to the edge of something and was deciding whether to take the next step. "The east garden wall," he said. Eleanor waited. "The repointing is complete." "It was completed last week," she said. "I left the assessment on your desk." "Yes," he said. "I read it." A pause. "I wanted to mention," he said, and stopped. He looked at the fire. He looked back at her. She watched him. This man who was excellent at everything that required composure, and who was currently discovering that composure was not always the right instrument. And she understood something that she had perhaps understood for some time, but had not permitted herself to state clearly until this moment. He was afraid. Not in the way of cowardice. In the way of a man who had organized his life with extraordinary care around the prevention of a particular kind of loss, and who had found, without having intended to, that the thing he had organized against had arrived anyway. She thought of what Lady Dorothea had said. "He asks after you in every letter. He does not ask after Mrs. Drummond, who has been here for 20 years. "James," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He had offered it to her weeks ago, and she had used it once, briefly, at the assembly, and had not used it since because she had not been ready to use it as naturally as she said it now, the way one says the name of someone one has decided on. He stilled completely. "The east garden wall is finished," she said. "And I have resolved the accounts to 1867. And the boundary case is concluded. And Margaret has received 2 letters this week from Mr. Fenwick, who appears to be a man of excellent character and serious intentions." A pause. "There is, as far as I can determine, nothing left to manage. Which means the only reason I am in this room at this hour is because I wish to be here. And I think you know that." He was looking at her with an expression that was not composed. It was not unguarded in the way of weakness. It was unguarded in the way of someone who has stopped defending a thing they no longer need to defend. "Eleanor," he said. Just her name. Nothing attached to it. But in the way he said it, in the quality of a single word from a man who chose all his words carefully and had not chosen this one carefully at all, had simply said it because it was the truest thing in the room, she heard everything that the 6 weeks had been building toward. Outside, the year was turning. Silent, unhurried, the way all significant things turned in the end. The fire settled. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. Not yet. The spring came early to Northumberland that year, or so Mrs. Drummond claimed, though she qualified this with the observation that it had also come early in 1854 and then proceeded to snow in April, so one ought not to become complacent. The East Garden, by March, had begun to justify the attention Eleanor had given it. The wall held. The beds she had cleared and replanted in November were beginning to show the first evidence of their investment. The kitchen garden produced, for the first time in several years, enough to make Mrs. Drummond revise her opinion of spring downward to merely skeptical. Margaret returned to London in February, on the occasion of a visit to the Fenwick family, in the company of Lady Dorothea's personal maid as chaperone. She wrote to Eleanor twice a week. Her letters were long and detailed and only occasionally mentioned Mr. Fenwick, which Eleanor found significantly more informative than if they had mentioned him constantly. The Duke of Ashmore was in Parliament for most of February. He wrote to his aunt, as he always had. The letters were longer than they had been before November. Lady Dorothea read them, said nothing, and left them casually on the library table where Eleanor would pass by. Eleanor read none of them. She was not in the business of reading other people's correspondence. She was, however, in the business of writing her own. The letter she wrote in the first week of March was 2 pages long. It concerned, primarily, the south fence line and the question of whether it required the same repointing attention as the east wall had, and the state of the kitchen garden accounts for the quarter, and whether the Duke had received the groundskeeper's report on the north pasture drainage. These were the things the letter said. They were not entirely the things the letter was about. His reply came within 4 days. It concerned, primarily, the parliamentary session and 2 pieces of legislation he was supporting and one he was opposing, and a question about a book Lady Dorothea had mentioned in her last letter, and whether the drainage report had included the specifications from the 1866 survey because he had a copy in London that might be relevant. These were the things his reply said. It was, like hers, 3 pages long. Lady Dorothea received her own letter from her nephew that same day. She read it over breakfast, said nothing, and then looked at Eleanor across the table with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for things to happen at the pace they were always going to happen. "He arrives on the 14th, she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He mentioned it." "Did he?" "In the letter," Eleanor said. "On the 3rd page." "I see," Lady Dorothea said. She returned to her breakfast with the perfect serenity of a woman who had arranged something that had then arranged itself and was now simply watching it complete. Outside, the Northumberland morning was doing what Northumberland mornings did, arriving with grey-gold light across the moors and making no particular promises about what the afternoon would bring. Eleanor drank her tea. She thought about the 14th. She did not think about it anxiously or impatiently or with the restless forward-leaning quality that comes from wanting something to arrive before it is ready. She thought about it the way she had learned, over the past months, to think about things that were real, with the quiet attention of someone who understood that the most significant things were rarely loud about it, and that the distance between a name asked at a jeweler's counter and 2 people sitting by a fire at the turn of the year was, in the end, not a distance at all. It was simply time. And time, she had discovered, had a way of arriving.